Welcome to the South Sudan National Participation Institute. In our today's presentation, we are going to talk about a search for a national consensus to achieving peace in South Sudan. That is a lasting peace. Of late, there is a lot of discussion about the national dialogue, about the implementation of the signed peace agreement, and about rebellions and the conflict in South Sudan, displacement, famine, mass killings, and so on. And for an outside observer, people usually wonder as to where all of this is happening and what are the root causes of this ongoing conflict. Where is South Sudan? So before we talk about our main topic, we are going to divide our presentation into 4 sections. The first part is going to give brief background information about South Sudan in terms of its land, the people, resources, and so on. And then the second section will talk about the history of South Sudan in the context of Sudan and in the context of independence since July 9, 2011. And then we will also talk about some of the attempts that were carried out in order to resolve the ongoing conflict in South Sudan. And then we will conclude our presentation by actually doing a lot of search for a national consensus to achieving a lasting peace in South Sudan. And in the interval, we will play music by the prominent South Sudanese musician Emmanuel Kembe, who has worked tirelessly in his search for lasting peace, social coexistence, and development in South Sudan. We're going to play some excerpts from his song entitled "Together, Let's Come and Build Our Nation." So this is what we're going to talk about. And to kick off our presentation, we're going to talk about background information about South Sudan. South Sudan is located in the eastern part of the continent of Africa, and it constitutes with Sudan, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda what is known as the Horn of Africa. And the land of South Sudan, prior to its independence in July 2011, it was actually part of what is known as the Sudan. And Sudan is actually a term given by Egyptian geographers to the land that falls south of the sub-Saharan Africa. So South Sudan, as was mentioned, prior to 2011 was part of the Sudan. And this land, together with the other parts of the Horn of Africa, were inhabited by different groups of people. The hunters and gatherers, the marsh dwellers, the Nilotics, the Hamites, the Nilo Hamites, the Sudanic group, not the territory, and then the Bantus. And there was and still continue to be a lot of movement of people in this region from historic times. And this movement of people actually intensified in the 16th century on. So, and the people in this region, as was mentioned, like the Nilotics and some of the Nilo Hamites and Hamites, they possess cattle, and they were constantly looking for pastoral lands. And then the other groups, like the Bantus and the Nilo Hamites and the Sudanic groups, are mainly farmers. But despite this, there was symbiotic relationships between these people. The Nilotics provided the other people with meat and milk, and then in turn the other groups provided this group of people with vegetables and beans and so on. Of course, there were intermittent conflicts between these groups, especially in terms of cattle rustlings and the conflicts between the farmers and the pastoralists. But at that time, it didn't amount to what we see now, where sophisticated weapons are used, and then the issues are politicized. And because of this politicization of the conflicts and the use of modern weapons, that has led to the death of millions of people, displacement, and mass killings and so on. So, but that is not the main discussion at this moment. The main discussion is just about the land and the people of South Sudan. At the moment, the people of South Sudan can be grouped into 4 groups. The Nilotic groups, the ones that live along the Nile, and then the Nilo Hamites, they also live along the Nile, and some live far away from the Nile. And then the Sudanic group, which includes the Moro and the Mahdi, and then the Bantu groups. These 4 main groups constitute the 64 tribes of South Sudan. So we're going to stop here. We're going to play some music, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about the history of South Sudan. But before we play the music, we would also like to mention that South Sudan is a very diverse country, as you can see, in terms of its population, but it's also diverse in terms of its natural resources. It has a lot of fertile land, a lot of mineral resources. It has the oil. It has a lot of animal resources and so on. And then in terms of vegetation and topography, the land is also so diverse. And that may probably be some of the factors that leads to a lot of competition and leads to the ongoing conflict in South Sudan, because of the personal ambitions and the other foreign ambitions to exploit these resources. So we will come back and talk more about these issues, but at this moment we're going to stop with a section of music. So please stay tuned. So welcome back. Prior to the invasion of Sudan by the then Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali, the Sudan and South Sudan never existed as a single entity. Not only South Sudan and North Sudan, but also the Western Sudan and the Eastern Sudan. But with the conquest of the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali, he was able to unite all these parts of Sudan into a single entity, which became known as the Sudan. And Muhammad Ali's main quest to conquer the Sudan was to search for slaves or manpower whom he had recruited in his Egyptian army after he has fallen out with the Turkish rulers in Istanbul. And then he was also searching for natural resources to finance his economy in Egypt. He was searching for gold, ivory, and other natural resources. And that's why he worked hard to unify the Sudan. And with his arrival to the Sudan, he also brought with him the practice of slavery, where people from the Arab and the Islamic world came to fetch some slaves and resources from South Sudan, and some of those resources and manpower were taken to be sold in international markets in the Middle East and in the New World. But that's not the topic of discussion today, but some of these practices had actually led to the conflict in the Sudan, the conflict that had mainly pitted the Arab Muslim North and the Christian African South. So, as was mentioned, with the arrival of Muhammad Ali, the Sudan became a single entity, and his rule continued from 1821 all the way to 1898. And in 1898, Sudan came under the condominion rule, and that condominion was between Great Britain and Egypt. And with the arrival of the condominion period, it was also the arrival of the colonial period. So, and during this time, the British actually worked hard to abolish the practices of slavery and so on. And then also Britain solidified its grip on the entire Sudan. But because of the British ambition to eradicate slavery, it divided the two parts of Sudan. Actually, rather, they introduced a policy that's called the closed district policy. And in this policy, the people of the two countries, the people of the south and the north, are separated, because the British also had a policy of annexing the South Sudan to the Eastern African region, which includes Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. The British government was kind of wary of the Arab and Islamic expansion into the interior of Africa. But in any case, this closed district policy was introduced in the 1930s and then some parts of the 1940s. But because there was also a struggle against colonialism throughout the world, and in particular in Africa, so the British decided to reunite the two parts of Sudan together, the South and the South Sudan, because at that time they also wanted to depart the South Sudan due to the anti-colonial sentiments in the Sudan and in Egypt. So in 1947, the British Commissioner of Sudan convened a conference in Juba known as the Juba Conference, and in that conference the main goal was to unify the two parts of the Sudan once again. And he was looking for a consensus between the South and the North to live in a single entity. The Northerners, of course, were for the unity, like immediate unity of the Sudan, but the Southerners at the time requested a gradual unity, whereby South Sudan will be given some time to develop itself economically and culturally, so that at least it will be at an equal footing with the North, and after that is achieved, then they can be able to be united together as a single entity. But the British didn't pay attention to the requests of the South Sudanese for a federal system, so the two countries, or the two parts of the country, were prematurely united. and that actually led to the conflict between the South and the North. And the root causes of the conflict at that time were political, religious, economic, and cultural exploitation. It's worth mentioning that the practices carried out by the slave traders led to the feelings of superior amongst the northerners towards the southerners that they consider as inferior to them. And there is also the racial and religious divides, the Arab Islamic North versus the African Christian and animist South. So when the two countries were united in 1947, and before Sudan gained its political independence in 1956, there was a mutiny, a military mutiny in one of the South Sudanese towns called Torit, and that occurred in 1955, actually 1 year prior to the Sudan's independence, because the South Sudanese forces at that time, the Equatorial Defense Forces at the time, rejected this forced unity, and that led to the conflict between the South and the North Sudan, a protracted conflict that continued from 1955 all the way to 1972. And that conflict was brought to an end because the regional community and the international community had seen the suffering of the people. There were about 500,000 people who perished in that protracted conflict, with severe social and economic consequences. A lot of people became displaced within the Sudan and in the neighboring countries. And because of that, the regional countries, championed by the then Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, there was a truce that was reached in 1972 between the Anyanya One, which was the South Sudan Liberation Movement at the time, and the then government of Sudan led by President Jafar Mohammed Nimeri. So there was a relative peace between 1972 to 1982. But then in the end of 1982, the then Sudanese president Nimeri, who signed the Addis Ababa Agreement, the first Addis Ababa Agreement with the South Sudanese rebels, the South Sudan Liberation Movement, he abrogated the agreement, and he said the agreement neither was a Quran nor the Bible. So he turned his back against the South Sudanese and then consolidated his relationships with the political forces in the north. So as a result, that led to the resumption of the conflict again in South Sudan. This time around, the conflict was championed by the Sudan's People Liberation Movement, the Sudan People Liberation Army, and instead of calling for a federal state in Sudan or a complete separation, as was led by the South Sudan Liberation Movement, the Anyanya One, the SPLA was now calling for a new Sudan on new basis of equality, justice, and equal economic development. So before we continue with this section of the presentation. We will stop here with another interval of music, and then when we come back we will talk about the Sudan's People Liberation Movement and the current conflict in South Sudan. So once again, please stay tuned. So welcome back. As it was mentioned, the Sudan's People Liberation Movement, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLM, as a result of Nimeri's dismantling of the Addis Ababa Agreement, the SPLA took up arms to fight the system of the government of Nimeri in Khartoum, which is the capital of South Sudan. And this time around, the SPLM was fighting, as was mentioned earlier, for a new united democratic Sudan where there is peace, there is freedom, there is equal power sharing, there is equal political and economic development. And the war continued for another period of 21 years until the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, in January 2005. Again, the reason that led to the signing of the agreement is because of the immense suffering of the people. About 2.5 million people perished, severe human rights abuses, more than 4 million people were displaced within the Sudan, in the neighboring countries, and and many people went or fled the country altogether and became refugees in other countries in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, and in the United States of America, and so on. And because of the immense suffering of the people, the international community, together with the IGAD, the regional power, AU, and so on, all of them worked hard now, of course, together with the efforts of the United States of America, championed by President Bush. They all worked together for the cessation of hostilities in the Sudan. And that led to the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, of course, it gave the right of self-determination for the people of South Sudan, because the international community had seen the protracted war that was going on in Sudan from 1955 to 1972, in which as was mentioned earlier, more than 500,000 people died, and again between 1983 to 2005, a lot of suffering and so on. The international community now granted the people of South Sudan the right of self-determination. And then there was an interim period of 6 years and a half in which a unity of Sudan was given another chance. So in other words, the government of Sudan, led by President Omar al-Bashir, was given another chance to make unity attractive to the people of South Sudan. But those years passed without any improvement in the situation. So on January 9th, 2011, the people of South Sudan actually voted for the separation of South Sudan. And in July 2011, South Sudan becomes an independent nation. Even though there are a number of sticking issues that are not finally resolved between the South and the North, but that will be a topic for another discussion. But in any case, 2 years after South Sudan gained its independence from the North, the country of South Sudan is plunged again into another civil conflict. And of course, in this conflict, the conflict actually started as a disagreement in the leadership of the Sudan's People Liberation Movement that is now controlling the South Sudan. The disagreement is over who is to lead the movement, which has become a dominant force in South Sudan, and who will become the president. And in all this, a lot of things happened. There was a lot of greed, there is a lot of selfishness, tribal politics become paramount, and then there are also foreign ambitions. As it was mentioned, South Sudan is a very rich country in terms of its natural resources and so on. So this led to the complication of the situation. And then the conflict erupted in December 2013, just 2 years after South Sudan becomes an independent country. And the reasons for the conflict is simply because the leaders of the SPLM could not agree about the national agenda for the country of South Sudan. It did not consult the people about the system of governance, about the usage of the resources, about the development, about the identity of the new nation. So because of these differences, there is a lot of personal differences, differences in approaching these issues of governance, of wealth sharing, of national development, and who will become the leader of South Sudan. And as a result of this, there is a lot of fragmentation in the SPLM. As we are speaking now, there are 4 factions of the SPLM. The SPLM in the government, the SPLM IO in opposition, which is part of the government, the SPLM in opposition, which is still fighting, and then the former political detainees. Of course, between 2011 and 2013, before the eruption of the conflict in South Sudan, a lot of political development had occurred that led to the ongoing conflict that is now going on in South Sudan. This conflict now also, a lot of people are killed, a lot of human rights abuses, there is a looming famine, and there is a search for peace in South Sudan. In 2015, there was an agreement, a comprehensive peace agreement. Two was also signed in the Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital, to try to address this the conflict that is ongoing in South Sudan. But the parties to the conflict didn't abide by the agreement, and that led to the resumption of the conflict in July 2016, and is still going on until today. So before we continue talking about the attempts to resolve the conflict in South Sudan, we will stop once again with another interval of music, and then when we come back, we'll continue from where we stopped. So once again, please stay tuned.